It's time again for the Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.
Hi, I'm Chuck Chvala, former Senate Majority Leader.
And I'm Scott Jensen, former Assembly Speaker.
We're the Insiders. So, Scott, huge election on Tuesday. What's your takeaway? Highlights for the Republicans and lowlights?
Well, first of all, for the state of Wisconsin, we retained our membership in the 1% Club. Once again, some of the key races in this state were decided by 1% of the vote or less. Excitingly, on the presidential side, Donald Trump won Wisconsin by 1%. So having won it in 2016 by 1%, lost it in 2020 by 1%, now comes ahead by 1% in 2024. And he did so by improving his numbers in places like Dane County, among Blacks in Milwaukee County, among younger voters, and he did better with women this time than either of the two previous races. So the coalition he has built now shows how Republicans in this state, who haven't won a lot of statewide races lately, how they can get that done. He went and campaigned in Dane County, which a lot of Republicans have been reluctant to do, but it paid off for him. So it was a big night on the Republican side for president. On the other hand, we just narrowly lost, I would say this is our low light, just narrowly lost the race for United States Senate. Very frustrating. Hovde came from way behind. A lot of people were counting him out for a long, long time. He ends up losing by less than 1% of the vote, 20-some thousand people across the state. A lot of people thought Baldwin was invulnerable. Some people predicted double digits initially. And in the end, she barely squeaked by.
Well, I resemble that remark. I thought that Baldwin would run substantially ahead of the top of the ticket. You got to own your mistakes. And I certainly felt it would be different. The Republicans ran a good race there. Definitely the Trump victory is a huge loss and kind of overwhelms everything else. Tammy Baldwin being able to pick up a win says a lot about Tammy's ability to campaign effectively in a difficult environment. And in 6 years, she's going to be up during a gubernatorial year, which will help her. On the other hand, though, the real highlight for Democrats is something that's being missed by everybody, and that is that the Democrats had an opportunity to pick up 4 state Senate seats. Republicans were predicting they would pick up 2. They actually picked up all 4, and that positions them so that Democrats in the state Senate, this House that I was so involved in, and I predicted they would get all 4, will be in a position and will win the majority 2 years from now. And that means they'll have to pick up at least 2 out of 3 of the Republican-held seats currently, plus defend the Jeff Smith seat up in Eau Claire. I think they'll be able to successfully do that. In fact, I will predict here, and we'll see how this changes as we get closer, that they will actually win all 4 of those seats and will be actually in an 18-15 majority. The other thing is, the Assembly, of course, there was a lot of talk, well, could they pick up the majority? That was always considered to be a very difficult thing. In fact, Scott Jensen, who actually has his best knowledge about the Assembly, put it dead on, with saying that the Democrats would get around 45 votes, and that's exactly where they ended. But the important thing to note about that is that there are 6 seats, maybe 7, where they'll be competitive, and they will have an opportunity to win the majority the next time. And I think they will actually be able to do that for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about over time. But at the end of the day, that is really the good news for Democrats in Wisconsin, that it's something going forward where they will actually get the majority. And the only reason they didn't make it now is because the gerrymander was so bad. It's going to take 2 cycles in the Senate because of who's up, and 2 cycles in the Assembly just to get enough numbers. Those are really big things. Oh, and by the way, here's the other highlight for Democrats. Even though this was terrible this year, what has happened is it has flipped. And Scott and I have talked about this. It used to be that if you were a Democrat in the Senate, you wanted to be up in the presidential year. That is now totally flipped. It is a far better year for Democrats to be up when the governor is up, not the president of the United States. And so we are going into the good, strong Democratic cycle when Donald Trump will not be on the ballot picking up more votes. So those are the highlights for Democrats, which actually are surprisingly good for the future of the Democratic Party in the state of Wisconsin.
I think you're right that the highlight for the Democrats on election night was the state Senate, where they ran the table and they picked up all 4 of those seats. It does put the Senate up for grabs in 26. 26 will be a midterm election in a president's second term, which is usually a very bad spot for the party in power and a good spot for the party that is out of power. So I think you can see how the Democrats can reasonably say we stand a good chance of picking up the state Senate in 26. I will say this, though, about the state assembly. The Dems were talking about possibly winning the state assembly, and there were predictions of 52 and 53 seats, which meant they would not only have had to run the table of all the reasonable seats, but ones that were out of reach. That was crazy talk. I think they were somewhat deluded by the extraordinary sums of money that they had available and their belief that the abortion issue would trump everything. And neither of those things happened in these elections, particularly in the state assembly, where, as I had predicted, the Republicans had an incumbent advantage. They had a number of people who had held the ballot before, who had run ahead of the top of the ticket, were likely to run 3 or 4 points ahead of President Trump. And when then Trump actually wins the state, that helped them significantly to win 54 seats, which is a 5-seat majority. And just as importantly, it is a working majority for Speaker Voss in that chamber. And I think it also shows that just having lots of money and one issue is insufficient to win these races that are somewhere between a local election and a statewide election. People know their state legislators. Well, a lot of people do. They've met them. They know a little bit about them. And Republicans were able to win these seats. And Novak, I don't know, he won wars in Dane County, for crying out loud. The guy was 5-6 points ahead of President Trump throughout his district. He won that handily. Dean Coffert won in the Fox Valley. You see Jesse Rodriguez won in a seat that was supposed to go to Democrats by 4 or 5 points. And she won it by almost 1,000 votes when all votes were cast. So I feel really good about it. And some of those people were outspent 3 and 4 to 1. I watched the Jesse Rodriguez during the Green Bay Packer game. I saw ads for president, United States Senate, and then ads trashing Jesse Rodriguez for crying out loud during a game. If you can compete with national money for a state assembly seat, my goodness, they had resources. And it looks like they spent somewhere between $3 and $4 million against her, and she ends up winning. So I think it was a good night for Republicans in the state assembly, but I agree with you. The state Senate is up for grabs in 26.
And so will the assembly be. And what Scott and I talked about, both the fact that Democrats are now doing better in a gubernatorial year and that this is a presidential situation. And the only way that people will be able to vote against Donald Trump in 2 years, he won't be on the ballot. The way to vote against him will be in state legislative and gubernatorial and other statewide elections. That is going to change this dynamic dramatically. And already you have seats, as Scott pointed out, that are leaning Democratic. This is not going to be good for them when it comes back to the gubernatorial year. Right now, they were running against a Biden administration that was wildly unpopular. And that is not going to be the case in 2 years. It's going to be running against Trump. So not only will the Democrats get to 18-15, I'm very confident that the assembly will have the majority. And assuming that we can win statewide, and again, I think that will happen. I think you're going to have the trifecta here of the assembly, Senate, and the governor's office, and also progressives will have the Supreme Court. And it will be a very different election 2 years from now for Republicans.
So do you think the Democrats will now beg Evers to run again in 26 to help them with all those other races down ticket?
That's a good question, and it remains to be seen. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to The Insiders with Chuck Chvala and Scott Jensen, sponsored by the Wisconsin Counties Association and the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership.